In 1953, my white mother was caught kissing my black father behind the church after Sunday service. By Tuesday, she was married to another man. By Thursday, she was planning her escape. I found my mother's journal when I was clearing out her things after she died. Hidden in a shoebox under her bed, wrapped in faded tissue paper, were 200 pages of her careful handwriting documenting a love story that was illegal in 1950s Alabama. Today I kissed Samuel behind the magnolia tree, read the first entry, dated June 15, 1953. I know it's wrong by everyone else's standards, but it felt like the most right thing I've ever done. My mother, Catherine, was 18 and the preacher's daughter. My father, Samuel, was 19 and worked at the sawmill on the other side of town. In the rigidly segregated South, their love wasn't just forbidden, it was dangerous. The journal detailed their secret meetings, how they'd leave coded messages for each other, how Samuel would wait by the creek after dark and Catherine would sneak out through her bedroom window, how they planned a future together that seemed impossible in Jim Crow, Alabama. But someone saw them that Sunday in June. Mrs. Henderson, the church busybody, spotted them through the stained glass window and immediately told Catherine's father. "Daddy came home from church meeting tonight with murder in his eyes," Catherine wrote. "He knows about Samuel. I can see it in the way he looks at me, like I'm something dirty that needs to be cleaned." What happened next was swift and brutal. That very night, Catherine's father and brothers found Samuel walking home from work. They beat him unconscious and left him bleeding in the road. When he woke up in the colored hospital, they told him to leave town or face worse, but Samuel didn't leave. Instead, he sent Catherine a message through her housemaid, Ruby, who was his cousin. He was hiding in the old tobacco barn on the abandoned Hartley farm. If Catherine could meet him there, they could run away together. Catherine never got the message. Her father had found out about Ruby's connection to Samuel and fired her immediately. He'd also arranged Catherine's marriage to David Morrison, the banker's son, to happen within the week. "I'm trapped," Catherine wrote. "In 3 days, I'll be Mrs. David Morrison. Samuel doesn't know what happened. He probably thinks I chose safety over love. I would rather die than marry David. But Daddy says if I refuse, he'll make sure Samuel is found and hanged for touching a white woman." The wedding took place on a sweltering Tuesday in June. Catherine's journal entry from that night was heartbreaking. "I said yes to David while my heart screamed for Samuel. Every vow was a lie. I kept looking toward the back of the church, hoping Samuel would somehow appear and take me away from this nightmare. But he didn't come. He doesn't even know I'm married now." David Morrison was everything a 1950s Southern family wanted in a son-in-law. Respectable, wealthy, connected to all the right people. But he was also cruel in ways that only his wife would ever see. "David hit me tonight for the first time," Catherine wrote a month after the wedding. "I burned his dinner because I was distracted thinking about Samuel. David said I needed to learn to focus on my duties as a wife. The bruise on my cheek is hidden by makeup, but I can feel it throbbing with every heartbeat." The abuse escalated quickly. David was careful to hit her where bruises wouldn't show. He controlled every aspect of her life, what she wore, where she went, who she spoke to. He made it clear that she belonged to him now, and Samuel was never to be mentioned again. But Catherine never stopped thinking about Samuel. Through Ruby's sister, who still worked for a family in town, she learned that Samuel had indeed left Alabama. Word was, he'd gone north to Detroit to work in the auto plants. He'd waited for her at the tobacco barn for 3 days before finally giving up. "He thought I abandoned him," Catherine wrote. "He thought I chose comfort over love. If only he knew that I think about him every day, that I dream about what our life could have been. I would trade this big house and all of David's money for 1 more hour with Samuel." The journal entries became darker as Catherine's marriage continued. David's abuse wasn't just physical, it was psychological and sexual too. He forced himself on her nightly, telling her it was her duty to provide him with children. When she didn't get pregnant immediately, he blamed her, and the beatings got worse. "Dr. Harrison examined me today," Catherine wrote after 2 years of marriage. "He says there's nothing wrong with me, that I should be able to have children. But what he doesn't understand is that I pray every night that I won't get pregnant. I can't bear the thought of bringing David's child into this world, of creating another person for him to control and hurt." But in 1956, Catherine's prayers weren't answered. She became pregnant, and David was overjoyed. Finally, he would have an heir to carry on the Morrison name. He even stopped hitting her, afraid of damaging his precious child. "David is treating me like a prized mare carrying his future stallion," Catherine wrote. "He's gentle now, but only because I'm carrying what he thinks is his son. What would he do if he knew the truth?" The truth was something that even I, reading her journal 60 years later, could barely comprehend. Catherine had been secretly meeting with Samuel again. He'd returned to Alabama in 1955, unable to stay away from the woman he loved. Working through Ruby's extended family network, he'd managed to get a message to Catherine. They'd started meeting in secret at the old tobacco barn where he'd waited for her 3 years earlier. "Samuel looks older now," Catherine wrote. "The years in Detroit have changed him. He's stronger, more serious. But when he looks at me, I see the same love that was there when we were teenagers. We both know this is dangerous, but we can't stay away from each other." Their reunion was bittersweet. Samuel had married a woman in Detroit, thinking Catherine was lost to him forever. But when he learned the truth about her forced marriage to David, he couldn't stay away. "We decided to be together one last time," Catherine wrote, "to have something something beautiful before we say goodbye forever. Samuel is going back to Detroit next week. His wife is pregnant, and he won't abandon his responsibilities. But we wanted one perfect night to carry with us for the rest of our lives. That perfect night changed everything, because 9 months later, I was born. The moment I arrived, everyone in the delivery room knew the truth. My dark skin, my features. There was no hiding who my father was. David's face went from joy to rage in seconds. Catherine thought he might kill her right there in the hospital. David hasn't spoken to me since the birth, Catherine wrote in shaky handwriting. He won't even look at the baby. His parents are devastated. The whole town is talking. I know what's coming. David will never forgive me for this humiliation. She was right. David's revenge was swift and calculated. He publicly accused Catherine of adultery and filed for divorce, claiming the child wasn't his. But he also had Samuel arrested on charges of rape, claiming that no white woman would willingly be with a black man. They arrested Samuel yesterday, Catherine wrote. David's father used his connections to make sure Samuel was charged with rape instead of adultery. The penalty for rape is death. They're going to kill him for loving me. The trial was a farce. Samuel had no chance in a 1956 Alabama courtroom. Despite Catherine's testimony that their relationship was consensual, the all-white jury convicted him of rape in less than an hour. He was sentenced to death by electric chair. But Catherine wasn't finished fighting. She'd learned something during the trial that could save Samuel's life. David had been having an affair with his secretary for years. She had photographs, love letters, evidence that would destroy his reputation and his family's standing in the community. I went to David's father today, Catherine wrote. I showed him the evidence of David's affair. I told him I would release everything to the newspapers unless Samuel's charges were reduced to adultery and he was allowed to leave Alabama alive. Mr. Morrison's face went white. The Morrison name means everything to this family. They can't afford a scandal. The backroom deal was struck within days. Samuel's death sentence was commuted to time served, and he was given 24 hours to leave Alabama and never return. Catherine was granted her divorce, but lost all rights to alimony or support. She was also banned from seeing me, David's final act of revenge. They're taking my baby from me, Catherine wrote. David's family has convinced the judge that I'm an unfit mother. They're giving custody to David, even though everyone knows he's not the father. I have no money, no family support, nowhere to go, but at least Samuel is alive. At least our love saved his life, even if it cost me everything else. Catherine left Alabama that same week, taking nothing but her clothes and her journal. She moved to Chicago, where she worked as a seamstress and tried to build a new life. Meanwhile, I grew up in the Morrison household, raised by David and his new wife, who told everyone I was an adopted orphan. I think about my baby every day, Catherine wrote in later entries. I wonder if he's safe, if he's happy, if David treats him well. I wonder if he'll ever know the truth about who his parents really are. I pray that someday, when he's old enough to understand, I'll find a way to tell him about the love that created him. But Catherine never got that chance. She died of cancer in 1978, alone in a Chicago hospital. Her landlord found the journal among her belongings and mailed it to the address she'd kept written on the inside cover, the Morrison house in Alabama, where she'd left her baby 22 years earlier. That baby was me. And I was 38 years old when I finally learned the truth about my parents. David Morrison had died 5 years earlier, taking the secret with him. His second wife, the woman I'd called mother my entire life, handed me the journal with tears in her eyes. I never knew the whole story, she said. David told me you were an orphan he'd adopted out of Christian duty. It wasn't until I read this that I understood what really happened. Your mother loved you so much that she sacrificed everything to save your father's life. Reading my mother's journal was devastating and enlightening at the same time. I finally understood why David had always treated me differently, why I'd never felt like I truly belonged in the Morrison family. I also learned about a love so powerful that it had overcome impossible obstacles and ultimately saved a man's life. But the story didn't end there. The journal included an address in Detroit where Samuel had returned after leaving Alabama. It was a long shot after 25 years, but I had to try to find him. The house in Detroit was still there, though the neighborhood had changed dramatically. An elderly woman answered the door and told me that Samuel had died 10 years earlier, but his son, my half-brother, still lived in the area. Meeting Marcus, my half-brother, was surreal. We looked remarkably alike despite being raised thousands of miles apart. He told me that Samuel had never forgotten Catherine or the son he'd left behind in Alabama. Dad talked about you all the time, Marcus said. He always wondered what happened to you if you were safe. He kept a picture that Catherine had sent him before you were born. He carried it in his wallet until the day he died. Marcus showed me the picture, a faded photograph of Catherine holding her pregnant belly, smiling despite everything she was facing. On the back, she'd written, "Our love made something beautiful." Through Marcus, I learned that Samuel had become a civil rights activist after leaving Alabama. He'd worked with the NAACP, helped register black voters, and fought for the same kind of equality that his love for Catherine had represented. He'd named his second son after me, though he'd never known my name. Marcus's younger brother was called David, which had been my legal name growing up. Dad always said that love was the most powerful force for change, Marcus told me. He said that people who were brave enough to love across racial lines were the real heroes of the civil rights movement. They were risking everything for the chance at equality. I spent several weeks in Detroit, learning about my father's life and meeting the family I'd never known I had. Samuel's widow, Gloria, welcomed me with open arms. She'd known about Catherine and understood that Samuel's heart had always carried room for both the love he'd lost and the love he'd found. Your father was a good man who lived with a broken heart, Gloria told me. He loved me, and we had a good marriage, but he never got over losing Catherine and you. Finding you would have meant everything to him. Before I left Detroit, Marcus gave me something that brought me to tears. It was a letter Samuel had written to me, sealed and dated just months before his death. He'd written it hoping that someday, somehow, it would find its way to the son he'd never been able to know. My dear boy, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means you've learned the truth about your parents. I want you to know that you were born from the greatest love I've ever known. Your mother was the bravest woman I ever met. She risked everything for love, and then she sacrificed everything to save my life. I've thought about you every day since I left Alabama. I've wondered what kind of man you've become, whether you inherited your mother's courage or my stubbornness. I've prayed that you were raised with love, even if it wasn't our love. I hope you understand that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did, but staying would have meant death, and your mother made sure I understood that you needed at least one parent to survive, even if you never knew who I was. Live your life with the same courage your mother showed. Love without limits, fight for what's right, and never be ashamed of the circumstances that brought you into this world. You are the product of a love that was stronger than hatred, stronger than racism, stronger than the laws that tried to keep us apart. I love you, son. I always have, and I always will. I carried that letter back to Alabama, where I visited Catherine's grave for the first time. She was buried in Chicago, but I had a memorial stone placed in the cemetery where she'd grown up. It simply read, Catherine Morrison. She loved without limits. The story of my parents' love affair had a profound impact on how I understood my own life and the civil rights movement. Their relationship had taken place during the same era as other interracial couples who challenged segregation laws, often at great personal cost. I researched other cases and found that my parents weren't alone. Across the South, there were couples who'd risked everything for love. Some had been successful in escaping to more tolerant areas. Others had faced violence, imprisonment, or death. All of them had been pioneers in their own way, challenging the racial barriers that seemed insurmountable. I eventually wrote a book about my parents' story, using Catherine's journal as the primary source. Love Across the Color Line became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary that aired on PBS. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out to share similar stories from their own families. Many readers had discovered interracial relationships in their family histories that had been hidden for decades. Others were children or grandchildren of couples who'd faced similar challenges. The book seemed to give people permission to acknowledge these hidden parts of their family stories. But the most meaningful response came from a group of elderly civil rights activists who invited me to speak at their annual conference. They told me that stories like my parents needed to be told because they showed that the fight for racial equality wasn't just about laws and politics. It was about real people who'd risked everything for love and dignity. Your parents were freedom fighters, one woman told me. They might not have marched with Dr. King or sat at lunch counters, but they fought for the same thing, the right to be treated as equal human beings. Their love was a form of resistance. I began speaking regularly about my parents' story, especially at schools and universities. Young people were often amazed to learn how recently interracial marriage had been illegal and how dangerous it had been for couples to challenge those laws. The story took on new relevance as I watched my own children grow up in a world where interracial marriage was not only legal, but increasingly common. My daughter married a man whose grandparents had also faced discrimination for their interracial relationship. My son's children are multiracial, representing a beautiful blend of backgrounds that would have been unthinkable in my parents' time. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if my parents had been born just 10 years later, after the civil rights movement had begun to change laws and attitudes. Would they have been able to stay together? Would I have grown up knowing both my parents? But then I remember what Samuel wrote in his letter, that I was the product of a love stronger than hatred, stronger than the laws designed to keep people apart. My parents' love story wasn't tragic because it was forbidden. It was powerful because they chose each other despite the consequences. Their love created not just me, but a ripple effect that touched hundreds of lives. Every person who read their story, every student who heard me speak, every family member who finally felt safe sharing their own hidden history, all of them were touched by the love that Catherine and Samuel had for each other. I keep my mother's journal on my desk now, next to my father's letter. They remind me daily that love is indeed the most powerful force for change, and that ordinary people can become heroes simply by choosing to love without limits. My parents never got their happy ending in the traditional sense. They didn't grow old together or watch their children graduate or celebrate anniversaries, but they did something perhaps more important. They proved that love can triumph over hate, even when the cost is everything you have. Their story continues to inspire people decades later, reminding us that the fight fight for equality is often fought in the most personal spaces, in the choice to love someone the world says you shouldn't love, in the decision to risk everything for the chance at happiness, in the courage to choose truth over comfort. Catherine and Samuel's love affair lasted only a few months, but its impact continues to this day. Every time someone chooses love over fear, every time someone stands up against injustice, every time someone refuses to let others dictate who they can and cannot love, they're carrying forward the legacy of my parents' forbidden love. That's the real power of their story. Not that they found a way to be together, but that they found a way to love that was stronger than everything designed to tear them apart. But there was one more chapter to their story that I didn't discover until years later. In 2019, 63 years after my birth, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about my family history. The caller was a genealogist named Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been researching family trees for a documentary about interracial relationships in the Jim Crow era. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I believe you're the author of Love Across the Color Line. I've been researching your family's story, and I've found something I think you need to know." Dr. Williams had been digging through court records, church documents, and old newspaper archives. What she'd discovered was that my parents' story was even more complex than I'd realized. "Your mother, Catherine, didn't just save your father's life," Dr. Williams explained. "She saved 17 other people, too." It turned out that the tobacco barn where my parents used to meet had been much more than a romantic hideaway. It was a station on the Underground Railroad, not the historical Underground Railroad from the 1800s, but a modern version that helped black families escape Southern violence in the 1950s. Samuel had been involved in this network since returning from Detroit. He'd been using the abandoned barn to hide families who were fleeing lynch mobs, police harassment, or economic retaliation for attempting to register to vote. Catherine had discovered this during their secret meetings and had quietly begun helping. She brought food, medicine, and money, Dr. Williams explained. But more importantly, she provided information. As the preacher's daughter and the banker's wife, she heard things that the black community couldn't access. She knew which roads were being watched, which families were being targeted, which officials could be trusted. The journal I'd found had only told part of Catherine's story. There was another journal, hidden in the barn itself, that documented her work with the Escape Network. Dr. Williams had found it during an archaeological survey of the property, which was being developed into a historical site. This second journal revealed a Catherine I'd never known. Not just a woman in love, but a civil rights activist who'd risked everything to help others find freedom. March 15, 1956, one entry read. "The Johnson family made it to Detroit safely. Baby Sarah was running a fever when they left, but Samuel's contact at the bus station had medicine waiting. I gave them the last of my household money. David will notice it's missing from the grocery fund, but I'll think of something to tell him." Another entry, dated just weeks before my birth. "Sheriff Patterson is planning raids on the colored section next week. Someone needs to warn the families who've been talking about registering to vote. I've left coded messages with Ruby's cousin at the grocery store. Samuel will know what to do." Dr. Williams showed me photographs of the barn as it looked now. The walls were covered with names and dates, a hidden record of all the families who had passed through on their way to freedom. My parents' initials were carved into a beam near the back wall, along with the date of my conception. But the most shocking discovery was a letter that Samuel had hidden in the barn before his arrest. It was addressed to Catherine, but she'd never found it because she'd been forced to stop visiting the barn when her pregnancy became visible. "My dearest Catherine," the letter began, "if something happens to me, I need you to know how proud I am of the work we've done together. You've saved more lives than you realize. The families we've helped will carry stories of your courage to their children and grandchildren." The letter went on to detail specific families they'd helped, money Catherine had provided, and dangerous information she'd passed along. It painted a picture of a woman who had been a true partner in the freedom movement, not just an innocent victim of circumstances. "I know the baby we're expecting will be born into a dangerous world," Samuel had written, "but I also know that child will be the son or daughter of two people who refuse to accept injustice. That's a legacy to be proud of." Dr. Williams had tracked down some of the families mentioned in the letters. Many were still alive, and they remembered the white woman who had helped them escape to safety in the North. "Mrs. Catherine saved our lives," said Doris Johnson, now 87 and living in Chicago. "My husband was going to be lynched for trying to vote. She got word to us that they were coming, and she gave us money for bus tickets. We named our youngest daughter after her." Another family, the Washingtons, had kept a photograph that Catherine had given them, a picture of herself that she'd signed, "With love and hope for your freedom." They'd framed it and kept it on their mantelpiece for over 60 years. "She was an angel," said Robert Washington, "a white woman who risked everything to help black families. We always wondered what happened to her. We heard she'd gotten in trouble over a baby, but we didn't know the details." Learning about this side of Catherine's life transformed how I understood her sacrifice. She hadn't just given up her comfortable life for love, she'd given it up for justice. Her relationship with Samuel had opened her eyes to the reality of racism in a way that her privileged upbringing never could have. The documentary that Dr. Williams was working on, titled The Hidden Railroad, featured my parents' story as one of several examples of unlikely allies in the civil rights movement. movement. When it aired on Netflix, it sparked a national conversation about the white allies who had risked everything to support racial equality. But for me, the most meaningful outcome was personal. Learning about Catherine's activism helped me understand where my own sense of social justice had come from. Throughout my life, I'd been drawn to causes related to civil rights and equality, never realizing that I was following in my mother's footsteps. I decided to honor Catherine's legacy by establishing a foundation that provides scholarships for students studying civil rights history. The Catherine Morrison Foundation has helped hundreds of young people research and document stories of unsung heroes from the freedom movement. One of our scholarship recipients, a graduate student named Maria Santos, made a discovery that brought the story full circle. She was researching women's roles in the civil rights movement when she found references to a white angel who had helped families escape from Alabama in the 1950s. Following the trail of documents and testimonies, Maria identified 17 families that Catherine had helped. She tracked down descendants and collected oral histories that had never been recorded before. "Your mother was more than just a love story," Maria told me when she presented her research. "She was a freedom fighter who used her privilege to save lives." The families she helped went on to become teachers, doctors, business owners. She changed the trajectory of dozens of lives. Maria's research became a book, The White Angel of Alabama, Catherine Morrison, and the Underground Railroad of the 1950s. It won the Pulitzer Prize for History and ensured that Catherine's contributions to the civil rights movement would be remembered alongside her love story. The book's publication led to another unexpected discovery. A woman named Ruby Jefferson contacted me, saying she was the granddaughter of Ruby, the housemaid who had been the connection between Catherine and Samuel. "My grandmother talked about Miss Catherine until the day she died," Ruby Jefferson told me. "She said Miss Catherine was the bravest white woman she ever knew. Grandma Ruby kept some things that belonged to her, letters, photographs, and something she said was very important. What Ruby Jefferson had preserved was Catherine's original wedding ring, the one she'd worn during her forced marriage to David Morrison. Catherine had given it to Ruby before leaving Alabama, with instructions to give this to my son someday, so he'll know I never forgot him. The ring was a simple gold band, but inside was an engraving that made me weep. For my true love and our children yet to come. S. Samuel had somehow managed to have a ring made for Catherine, even knowing they could never be legally married. She'd worn it hidden beneath David's ring throughout her marriage, a secret symbol of where her heart truly lay. I wear that ring now, on a chain around my neck. It reminds me daily of the love that created me, but also of the courage that defined both my parents. They weren't just star-crossed lovers, they were freedom fighters who believed that love and justice were the same thing. The complete story of my parents has become part of civil rights curricula in schools across the country. Students learn about the legal battles and famous leaders, but they also learn about ordinary people like Catherine and Samuel who risked everything for what they believed was right. My own children and grandchildren have grown up knowing the full truth about their heritage. They understand that their multiracial identity isn't just the result of changing laws, but the legacy of ancestors who refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on love. Last year, on what would have been Catherine's 85th birthday, the city of Montgomery erected a historical marker at the site of the old tobacco barn. The inscription reads, "In honor of Catherine Morrison and the families she helped escape to freedom, love and justice are the same fight." At the dedication ceremony, descendants of the families Catherine had saved gathered to honor her memory. Children and grandchildren of people whose lives she'd changed shared stories passed down through generations about the white woman who had risked everything to help them find freedom. "She saw us as human beings when the law said we weren't," said Thomas Johnson, Doris's grandson. "She proved that love really can conquer hate, even when the consequences are terrible." Samuel's descendants were there too, Marcus and his children, along with cousins and extended family members who had grown up hearing stories about the love that had changed everything. We stood together, black and white family members united by a love story that had begun in hatred but ended in hope. The marker stands now as a testament to what's possible when people choose love over fear, justice over comfort, courage over safety. Every year, civil rights tourists visit the site, taking pictures and sharing the story of the forbidden love that helped so many find freedom. But the real legacy isn't in the monument or the books or the documentaries. It's in the lives that were saved, the barriers that were broken, and the example that was set for future generations. Catherine and Samuel's love lasted only a few months in person, but it created ripples that are still spreading today. Every person who chooses to stand up against injustice, every individual who risks something to help others, every family that loves across racial lines without fear, they're all carrying forward the legacy of that forbidden love. Their story reminds us that the most powerful force for social change isn't legislation or politics, but the simple human decision to love without limits. When people are brave enough to love across the lines that society draws, they don't just change their own lives, they change the world. My parents never got to grow old together, but their love grew into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. It became a foundation for justice, a catalyst for change, and a reminder that the most dangerous thing cling to a system built on hatred is two people who dare to love each other anyway. That's the true power of their story. Not that love conquered all, but that love became the weapon that others could use to conquer injustice for generations to come. 25 years after discovering my mother's journal, I received a letter that would forever change how I understood the ripple effects of my parents' love story. The letter was from the Supreme Court of the United States, specifically from the office of Justice Elena Kagan. It was brief, but earth-shattering. Dear Mr. Morrison, we would like to invite you to attend oral arguments in the case of Williams versus Alabama. Your parents' story has become central to our understanding of the historical context surrounding interracial marriage laws. Williams versus Alabama was a case involving marriage equality that had worked its way up through the federal court system. The plaintiff's lawyers had cited Catherine and Samuel's story as evidence of the long-term damage caused by laws prohibiting interracial marriage, arguing that such restrictions had created patterns of institutional discrimination that persisted decades after Loving versus Virginia. But there was more to the invitation than I initially understood. Justice Kagan's clerk called me later that week to explain that one of the justices had a personal connection to my family's story. Justice Clarence Thomas, it turned out, was the grandson of Robert Washington, one of the families my mother had helped escape Alabama in 1956. The Washingtons had settled in Georgia, where Thomas's grandfather had found work and eventually saved enough money to buy land. The family's economic stability, made possible by Catherine's help, had created opportunities that led, generations later, to a seat on the nation's highest court. Justice Thomas has spoken privately about the white woman who saved his family, the clerk explained. He's carried that story his entire career, though he's never spoken about it publicly. Your mother's courage made his family's American dream possible. I flew to Washington for the oral arguments, bringing with me Samuel's letter and Catherine's ring. In the marble halls of the Supreme Court, surrounded by the majesty of American justice, I thought about how my parents' forbidden love had somehow led to this moment. During a recess, Justice Thomas approached me quietly. He was a man who rarely showed emotion publicly, but tears filled his eyes as he shook my hand. Your mother saved my grandfather's life, he said simply. Everything my family achieved, everything I've accomplished, started with her courage. She didn't just help people escape Alabama. She helped them escape poverty, violence, and hopelessness. He told me that his grandfather had never forgotten Catherine's kindness. Before his death in 1987, Robert Washington had made his family promise to honor the memory of the white woman who had risked everything to help them. Grandpa used to say that Mrs. Catherine proved that goodness isn't about race or class or religion, Justice Thomas said. It's about choosing to do what's right, even when the cost is everything you have. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of Williams, citing the long-term societal damage caused by restrictions on interracial marriage. In his concurring opinion, Justice Thomas wrote about the historical context, mentioning unnamed individuals who had risked everything to help others find freedom and dignity in love. Those who knew the backstory understood he was writing about my mother. The case decision sparked renewed interest in civil rights history, particularly the stories of white allies who had worked alongside black activists. Publishers contacted me about updating my book to include the new discoveries about Catherine's activism. Film studios inquired about movie rights to the complete story, but the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source, the state of Alabama. Governor Kay Ivey's office contacted me with a formal apology and an invitation to establish a state-sponsored civil rights education center focused on untold stories from the movement. The Catherine Morrison Center for Civil Rights Education would be built on the site of the original tobacco barn, transforming the place where my parents had fallen in love into a space for learning about justice and equality. Alabama has a complex history, Governor Ivey said at the groundbreaking ceremony. We've made terrible mistakes, but we've also been home to heroes whose stories deserve to be told. Catherine Morrison was one of those heroes, and her story reminds us that progress comes from individuals who choose courage over comfort. The center opened 3 years later, featuring interactive exhibits about the Underground Railroad of the 1950s, oral histories from families who had been helped by the network, and educational programs for students of all ages. The centerpiece was a recreation of the tobacco barn, complete with the carved initials and hidden journals that had preserved so much history. On opening day, over 300 descendants of the families Catherine had helped attended the ceremony. They came from across the country, doctors, teachers, engineers, business owners, and public servants whose lives had been made possible by a young white woman's decision to risk everything for justice. The ceremony featured a choir made up entirely of descendants, singing freedom songs that their grandparents had hummed while fleeing Alabama in the night. As their voices rose in harmony, I thought about how Catherine and Samuel's love had grown into something larger than either of them could have imagined. But the most powerful moment came when the youngest descendant, 6-year-old Amara Johnson, placed a wreath at the base of the memorial. She was Thomas Johnson's great-granddaughter, representing the 5th generation of a family that had survived because of Catherine's courage. "Thank you, Mrs. Catherine," Amara said in her clear, young voice, "for helping my family find freedom." The center became a pilgrimage site site for civil rights tourists, but also a working research facility where scholars continued to uncover lost stories from the movement. Graduate students came from around the world to study the documents preserved there, adding new names to the list of unsung heroes who had fought for justice in quiet, dangerous ways. One discovery particularly moved me: a collection of letters between Catherine and other white women who had secretly supported the Freedom Network. These women, scattered across the South, had formed an unofficial network of their own, sharing information and resources to help families escape violence and persecution. "We call ourselves the Magnolia Circle," Catherine had written in one letter. "We may not be able to march in protests or register voters, but we can use our positions to gather intelligence and provide safe passage. Every family that makes it to freedom is a victory against the system that oppresses us all." The letters revealed that Catherine had been part of a much larger network than anyone had realized. White women in positions of privilege, bankers' wives, preachers' daughters, politicians' sisters, had been secretly working to undermine the very system that gave them their status. This discovery led to another book, The Magnolia Circle: White Women's Secret War Against Jim Crow, which became required reading in women's studies and civil rights courses across the country. The book revealed that the civil rights movement had been supported by a hidden army of white allies, particularly women who had used their access to white society to gather crucial information. The research also uncovered something that had been lost to family lore. Catherine had been pregnant with twins. The stress and violence of her situation had caused her to lose one of the babies during her 7th month of pregnancy. Only I had survived. This revelation came from medical records that Dr. Williams had found in the archives of the Colored Hospital, where Catherine had received secret prenatal care. She'd been hiding her pregnancy from David as long as possible, but she'd also been terrified for the baby's health given the constant stress and occasional violence she endured. "Patient presence with severe emotional distress," the doctor had noted. "Fears for safety of unborn children. Evidence of physical trauma consistent with domestic violence. Patient refuses to identify perpetrator, but insists she cannot involve law enforcement." Learning about my lost sibling was heartbreaking, but it also helped me understand the full scope of what Catherine had endured. She'd been fighting not just for her own survival and freedom, but for the lives of 2 children conceived in love, but born into a world that saw them as evidence of criminality. The medical records also revealed that several other women in similar situations had sought care at the same hospital. The Black medical community had quietly provided care for white women involved in interracial relationships, understanding that these women had nowhere else to turn. This led to yet another research project documenting the role of Black healthcare providers in supporting interracial families during the Jim Crow era. Many of these doctors and nurses had risked their licenses and their lives to provide care to people who had been rejected by white medical facilities. As I grew older, I began to understand that my parents' story was part of a much larger tapestry of resistance that had been largely hidden from history. Every thread, every couple who dared to love, every ally who provided help, every child who survived to tell the story was essential to the pattern of change that eventually transformed American society. My grandchildren often ask me about their great-grandparents, wanting to understand how they fit into this legacy of courage and love. I tell them that they are the living proof that love really can change the world, but only when people are brave enough to act on that love, even when the consequences are terrible. Your great-grandmother Catherine and great-grandfather Samuel didn't just create a family, I tell them. They created a legacy of justice that you carry forward every time you stand up for what's right, every time you choose love over fear, every time you refuse to let others decide who you can and cannot be. The Catherine Morrison Center has become a living laboratory for understanding how individual acts of courage can create systemic change. Students who visit leave with a deeper understanding that the civil rights movement wasn't just about famous leaders and landmark court cases. It was about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices in moments when they could have chosen safety instead. Every year on June 15th, the anniversary of that first kiss behind the magnolia tree, the center hosts a Day of Courage, where visitors are challenged to identify ways they can use their own privilege and position to fight injustice in their communities. The day has become a model for similar events at civil rights sites across the country, emphasizing that the fight for equality is not a historical relic, but an ongoing responsibility that each generation must embrace. This year, on what would have been Catherine's 90th birthday, the center unveiled its most ambitious project yet, a digital archive containing over 10,000 documents, photographs, and oral histories related to interracial relationships and underground resistance networks during the Jim Crow era. The archive, available free to researchers worldwide, has already led to new discoveries about the scope and sophistication of the networks that helped families escape Southern violence. It's also helped hundreds of people trace their own family histories and understand connections they never knew existed. But perhaps the most important legacy of my parents' story is the understanding it has provided about the nature of love itself. Their relationship wasn't just a romantic tragedy, it was a political act, a form of resistance, a declaration that human dignity could not be legislated away. Every couple couple who loves across lines that society draws, every family that refuses to be divided by prejudice, every individual who chooses justice over comfort, they are all carrying forward the legacy of that forbidden love that began behind a magnolia tree in 1953. Catherine and Samuel's love story didn't end with their separation, or even with their deaths. It continues every time someone chooses to love without limits, every time someone risks something to help others find freedom, every time someone refuses to accept that injustice is simply the way things have to be. Their love became the foundation for justice, and their story continues to inspire new generations of freedom fighters who understand that the most powerful weapon against oppression is the simple, radical act of choosing to love anyway. That's the true measure of their legacy, not that they found a way to be together, but that they showed others how love could be transformed into a force for justice that would outlast any law, any barrier, any attempt to divide what should never have been separated in the first place.